November 1956, a date that should be permanently etched into the consciousness of every American citizen who values their current standard of living and economic security. On this crisp autumn day, something absolutely extraordinary happened that fundamentally changed the trajectory of world history forever. The most powerful empire that had ever existed in human civilization, an empire that once commanded and controlled nearly a quarter of the Earth's entire land surface, an empire whose currency had served as the unquestioned backbone of international commerce for more than 100 consecutive years, was brought to its knees in just 11 devastating days. This wasn't the result of a catastrophic military defeat on some distant battlefield. This wasn't the outcome of a bloody revolution or a popular uprising against imperial rule. No foreign armies marched triumphantly on London. No bombs fell destructively on British soil. Instead, the mighty British Empire was systematically destroyed by something far more mundane, yet infinitely more powerful in the modern world. A single telephone call from Washington to London. On that fateful call, high-ranking representatives of the United States government delivered an ultimatum that would echo through the corridors of history for generations to come. Stop your military operation in Egypt immediately, they demanded with absolute authority, or we will systematically collapse your currency through coordinated financial warfare. We will dump every British pound sterling in our massive government reserves onto the international markets simultaneously. We will personally veto your desperately needed emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund. We will stand by and watch your entire national economy burn to the ground. Britain, the proud nation that had once ruled the waves with unquestioned naval supremacy, had absolutely no choice whatsoever in the matter. Within mere hours of receiving this devastating ultimatum, the greatest empire the world had ever witnessed surrendered completely and unconditionally. Not to an enemy army with superior weapons, not to foreign invaders with revolutionary tactics, but to the crushing weight of its own accumulated debt burden, to its own systemic financial weakness, to the stark reality that it was no longer the global powerhouse it desperately believed itself to be. That pivotal moment, which historians now call the Suez Crisis, was indeed the final nail in the coffin of British global dominance and international prestige. But here's what your high school history teacher never told you about this crucial period. Here's what the mainstream history books conveniently omit from their carefully sanitized narratives. Britain didn't fall because of that one isolated crisis in the Middle East. Britain fell because for decades before that pivotal moment, it had been systematically making the exact same catastrophic financial mistakes that America is making right now, today, in 2026. And by 2026, those identical mistakes may finally catch up with us in ways that will fundamentally transform American society. Let me show you exactly what happened to Britain, step by step. Because when you see this historical pattern laid out clearly, you will never look at America's current trajectory the same way again. To understand how the British Empire collapsed so dramatically, you first need to understand how Britain rose to such unprecedented heights in the first place. During the 19th century, Britain was the undisputed master of the entire global economy. The British pound sterling wasn't just another currency among many international competitors in the global marketplace. It was the currency that mattered most for all significant economic transactions worldwide. When countries around the world wanted to trade with each other for essential goods and commodities, they automatically used British pounds as their medium of exchange. When central banks needed to store their precious national reserves safely for emergency purposes, they stored them exclusively in British pounds. When major international contracts were written for large-scale transactions involving multiple nations, they were written exclusively in British pounds without exception. This monetary dominance gave Britain what can only be described as an almost supernatural economic power over the entire global financial system. They could literally print money out of thin air to fund their enormous military expenditures around the globe without facing immediate economic consequences. They could borrow vast amounts of money at incredibly low interest rates because every investor on Earth trusted the stability and reliability of the British pound above all other currencies. They could run massive trade deficits year after year, decade after decade, because the rest of the world needed their currency far more than Britain needed to balance its books properly or maintain fiscal responsibility. Does this sound familiar to you yet? It absolutely should, because this is exactly the privileged position America holds today with the US dollar in international markets. But there was a dangerous problem brewing beneath the surface of British prosperity and apparent economic stability. By the late 1800s, a formidable new economic power was rising rapidly across the Atlantic Ocean with unprecedented speed. The United States had officially surpassed Britain as the world's largest economy by total output and industrial production capacity. American factories were outproducing British factories in almost every important category of manufactured goods. American technological innovation was outpacing British innovation in critical areas like steel production, railroad construction, and telecommunications. American wealth was accumulating faster than British wealth had ever grown during its peak years. Yet despite these fundamental shifts in underlying economic reality, the British pound remained completely dominant in international markets for many years afterward. Why would this be the case when economic fundamentals had changed so dramatically? The answer lies in something economists call institutional inertia and network effects. The entire world had become completely accustomed to using British pounds for everything important. The complex financial infrastructure of global commerce was built entirely around the pound-sterling system, with established banking relationships, exchange mechanisms, and trade protocols. Changing to a completely new monetary system would be massively inconvenient for everyone involved and would require enormous coordination costs across multiple countries and institutions. So even as Britain's actual economic foundation steadily weakened year by year, its currency remained artificially strong for an extended period. This created a dangerous illusion of continued prosperity that would ultimately prove fatal to the empire. Then came World War I, and everything changed forever. Britain borrowed absolutely staggering sums of money to finance their war effort against Germany. By the time the guns finally fell silent in 1918, Britain had undergone a complete financial transformation. They had gone from being the world's largest creditor nation to becoming one of the world's largest debtor nations. They owed enormous amounts of money to everyone, but especially to the United States, which had become their primary lender. But instead of accepting this new financial reality, instead of adjusting their spending patterns and their global ambitions to match their dramatically diminished economic position, Britain made what would prove to be a completely fatal choice. They decided to pretend that nothing fundamental had changed at all. In 1925, Britain made what many respected historians now consider to be one of the single greatest economic blunders of the entire 20th century. They voluntarily returned to the gold standard at exactly the same pre-war exchange rate they had maintained before World War I. They desperately wanted the British pound to be worth exactly the same as it had been before the devastating war, even though Britain itself was no longer worth what it had been before that war. This decision was driven by pure ego, absolute denial of reality, and it proved to be economically devastating. To maintain this artificially high value of the pound sterling, Britain was forced to keep interest rates at painfully high levels. This monetary policy completely strangled domestic economic growth throughout the 1920s. Unemployment rates soared to Depression-era levels. British exports became far too expensive for foreign buyers to afford, which further weakened their trade position. Meanwhile, British political leaders continued spending taxpayer money as if they still ruled a global empire that generated unlimited wealth. They maintained expensive military bases scattered across every continent. They funded imperial administrative systems they could no longer afford to operate effectively. They borrowed money constantly, adding to their debt burden month after month, year after year. Are you starting to see the pattern yet? Does any of this sound even remotely familiar? The serious cracks in Britain's financial facade really started to become visible during the 1930s. During the global economic catastrophe known as the Great Depression, currency speculators began aggressively attacking the British pound. These financial predators could clearly see that the mathematics simply didn't add up anymore. Britain was consistently spending more money than it earned through taxation and trade. They were borrowing more money than they could realistically ever repay. They were pretending that international reputation and historical prestige alone would somehow keep their entire monetary system functioning indefinitely. In 1931, Britain was finally forced off the gold standard entirely. The pound lost nearly 30% of its international value almost overnight. This was a massive humiliation for a nation that prided itself on financial stability and economic leadership. But here's what's truly remarkable about this story. Even after this devastating public humiliation, the British pound somehow remained a major reserve currency for central banks worldwide. How was this even possible? The answer reveals something crucial about how these currency systems actually work. Britain was able to maintain artificial demand for its currency through what was essentially economic coercion. The British Empire forced all of its numerous colonies to hold their national reserves exclusively in British pounds. India, Australia, Pakistan, and dozens of other territories around the world had absolutely no choice but to continue using British currency for their international transactions. Britain was essentially holding its own colonial territories hostage to prop up its rapidly failing financial system. The parallels to America today should be absolutely terrifying. The petrodollar system, where crude oil is priced exclusively in US dollars, has forced the entire world to hold American currency, whether they want to or not. The crucial difference is that colonies eventually gain their independence, and oil-producing nations eventually grow tired of American foreign policy interference. Then came World War II, and Britain borrowed even more heavily than before. This time, they accumulated debts exceeding £14 billion, which was an absolutely astronomical sum for that historical era. By 1945, Britain owed more total money than their entire national economy produced in a full year. The empire was essentially bankrupt in every meaningful sense, surviving only because of continued American loans and American patience with their impossible situation. And still, incredibly, British political leaders absolutely refused to accept the new reality. They continued keeping their military forces deployed in expensive operations around the world. They kept pretending to be a global superpower. They kept spending enormous amounts of money they simply didn't have on international prestige they could no longer afford to maintain. This stubborn denial brings us directly to 1956, and the moment when everything finally collapsed completely. When Egypt's president decided to nationalize the strategically important Suez Canal, Britain saw this action as a direct challenge to their remaining authority, a serious threat to their access to Middle Eastern oil supplies, and a personal insult to their fading imperial pride. Working together with France and Israel, Britain launched a major military invasion to retake control of the canal by force. The military operation was actually succeeding on the ground. British forces were steadily advancing. Egyptian resistance was crumbling under the assault. But Britain had forgotten something absolutely crucial about their new position in the world. They were no longer the world's banker. America was now in that position, and America was absolutely furious about this unauthorized military adventure. President Eisenhower saw this invasion as old-fashioned 19th century colonialism, exactly the kind of imperial behavior that was pushing newly independent nations toward alliance with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. He decided to teach Britain a lesson they would never, ever forget. Now here's where the story becomes terrifying for every American watching this content on Economic Rewind. The United States today is following the exact same playbook that ultimately destroyed Britain. Not similar patterns, not comparable situations, but identical steps leading to the same predictable outcome. Britain's debt-to-GDP ratio after World War II reached approximately 120%. America's current debt-to-GDP ratio has already exceeded 120% and continues climbing every single month. Britain maintained expensive military bases around the world they couldn't afford. America currently maintains over 800 military installations in more than 70 countries worldwide. Britain kept borrowing money to maintain their lifestyle. America adds approximately $2 trillion to the national debt every single year. Britain believed their currency would remain dominant forever because of historical precedent. America believes the exact same thing about the dollar because we won the Cold War and built the internet. Britain ignored every warning sign until it was too late to change course. America is ignoring the exact same warning signs right now, today. The Congressional Budget Office has already projected that interest payments on America's national debt will exceed $1 trillion annually within the next few years. We will soon be spending more money on interest payments than we spend on national defense. We will be spending more on debt service than we spend on Medicare for senior citizens. We will become exactly like a household that is so deep in credit card debt that the monthly minimum payments alone consume the majority of their entire paycheck. When Britain reached this critical point, the end came with shocking speed. There was no gradual decline over many years. There was no gentle transition period. One day, Britain was making demands and issuing ultimatums to other nations. The very next day, Britain was taking orders and accepting conditions from their creditors. One day, the British pound was a symbol of global economic power and international prestige. The next day, it had become a cautionary tale about imperial overreach and financial irresponsibility. Here at Economic Rewind, we've studied the patterns that destroy empires, and the British Empire made many serious mistakes during its final decades of decline. But its ultimate mistake, The one that finally sealed its fate permanently was the absolute refusal to acknowledge what was happening right in front of their faces. British political leaders kept telling themselves that international reputation would somehow substitute for economic reality. They convinced themselves that their historical achievements entitled them to a secure future, regardless of current circumstances. They believed the world owed them something special because of who they used to be in previous centuries. America is telling itself the exact same story right now, today. We believe that because we defeated the Soviet Union in the Cold War, because we invented the internet and social media, because we put human beings on the moon, the world will continue accepting our currency and our global leadership forever and ever. We believe that being American somehow means the fundamental rules of mathematics and economics simply don't apply to us. Every single fallen empire in human history believed exactly the same thing about themselves. The British pound sterling didn't collapse because of external enemies or foreign military threats. It collapsed because of internal choices to spend more money than they earned through productive economic activity, choices to borrow from the future instead of building for the future, choices to maintain national pride instead of maintaining fiscal solvency, choices to live in the past instead of preparing for the reality of a changing world. America is making those exact same choices right now, every single day. And the clock is ticking faster than most people realize. I'm not telling you this information to make you feel hopeless about the future. I'm telling you this because history provides the best education available, but only if we're actually willing to learn from previous mistakes. Britain ignored every possible warning sign until it was too late to change course. We still have a narrow window of opportunity to do something different. But that window is closing rapidly. The timeline should concern every American family. Britain's transition from apparent strength to obvious weakness took approximately 30 years, from 1920 to 1950. But the final collapse, when it actually came, took less than 2 weeks to complete. America's transition has been underway since at least the 1970s, when we abandoned the gold standard completely. We have been running trade deficits every single year since 1975. We have been accumulating debt at an accelerating pace since the 2008 financial crisis. The foundation has been weakening for over 50 years, which means the collapse, when it finally comes, will be even more sudden and devastating than Britain's was. I cannot predict if that collapse will come specifically in 2026. Nobody can predict the exact moment when international confidence breaks. But I know that every year that passes without fundamental changes makes the eventual reckoning dramatically worse. The question facing America isn't whether we will face our own Suez moment. The question is whether we will be prepared when that moment inevitably arrives, whether we will have built the resilience, the savings, and the real productive capacity necessary to weather the coming storm. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it definitely rhymes. And right now, the rhyme between Britain then and America now is almost perfect. Here at Economic Rewind, we'll continue tracking these patterns and warning signs, because the British Empire's final mistake was believing it was too big to fail. America is making that exact same mistake right now. We are living in the echo of history, following footsteps that lead directly off a cliff. The only question remaining is whether we will wake up in time, or whether 2026 will become our 1956.